Yeah.
Okay. Would you share with us which has been the achievement you have been proudest of?
I think overall, taking in all the different things that I've been involved with, I think the RAC Special Interest Group is probably the most important thing that I've been involved with that I'm very proud of. I think it's been a great group, and it's certainly not all my doing. There's been a lot of people who have contributed a lot to it, but I think it's one of the most important developments in my career time that I guess has influenced what I do to some degree. But it's been a great experience to be involved with it from the very beginning and helping build it into a great group that's very active.
The Oracle RAC.
The RAC-SIG, the RAC Special Interest Group.
Your work is terrific.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to not miss the webcast.
Yep, the webcasts are really great.
Great job.
Yeah, it's been a great thing. We've had a great support from Oracle and as well as from IUG and the community as well. It's been really great.
Okay. Now tell us about one that has been very challenging. Very.
Oh, like a project, you mean, or
Project.
something like that? Yeah, we did have a project that was challenging. It wasn't that long ago. I guess maybe it was just the most recent challenge that we've had. It was a performance-related issue, and it was an interesting case where there was a product that was web services based, and the back-end provider was very disconnected from the front-end providers, and they had some very, very tight service level agreements around how fast those web service interfaces respond. So it had to respond in 2 seconds or less, or they actually had to pay money to other people. So it was a very high profile, very high pressure thing. For a very high transaction volume online customer loyalty type program, and boy, it was a big challenge. There was a lot of code and trying to figure out, because it was so disconnected, figuring out that when you click on this button on the website, and that was a whole nother company that built the front end website and maintained it, to figure out what happened behind the scenes and why it was slow, was digging through a lot of different stages and layers in the stack to figure out that called a web service, that called 2 other web services, that eventually called a Java bean, that called a PL SQL package that eventually ran this query that was generated on the fly. It was very difficult to tune generated queries that came through 5 layers of stuff when you didn't have any control over the input. So it was very challenging. I think we eventually did succeed and improved performance, but more importantly, in that case, we made some recommendations for some longer-term changes to the environment that would really restructure things in a different way to make it a little bit more scalable. Ultimately, that was the real challenge, was scaling it to the number of users. The company that it was for would launch online promotions with very little notice that would send 6 times more traffic to the website all of a sudden without warning. It was very challenging. Interestingly, that was not a RAC environment either, so that was part of the next steps for them, was to consider and test a RAC solution, which hopefully would help them scale ultimately.
Okay,
very
great.
challenging.
What learnings can you share with us regarding a failure you recall? Just the learnings.
I think the biggest thing I've learned throughout all of the consulting work that I've done has been that there's never enough documentation of what we do. As consultants, that's ultimately the legacy we leave, because very few people remember the actual consultant that was there for a month and did this, and this, and they're often quick to blame the guy who configured it all, who's not here anymore. And that's okay, I don't particularly mind that, but the lesson to be learned, I think, for me has been that I spend and add, usually to my projects that I work on, I add a significant percentage of time. I mean, I guess by significant meaning, if it's a 3-month project, it might be a week of documentation time that's built into that at the end, which seems to me to be a lot, but I try to make sure that there's dedicated time for writing down all of the configuration, all the processes we went through, and all of the things we looked at and didn't change, which I think is oftentimes what gets left out in a document that's created, is to create a list of recommendations, but not to you don't create the list of all the things you looked at that you didn't recommend, all the things that you thought about and didn't actually invoke a recommendation for, because those are valuable things. And ultimately, when in a consulting mode, it's important that the customer knows that you weren't just screwing around for 3 weeks and that you actually were looking at all these things that you didn't recommend anything about. And that's valuable for them too, to know that you put your stamp of approval on these certain areas that didn't require recommendations. So documentation is key for everything I do, and it's also very useful. Just briefly, there was another case just in the last 2 weeks where a customer we had recently done a data guard configuration for, and we had created a standby site for him and gone through a test just over Labor Day weekend, just a month ago. We did a test of failing over to his standby site, brought everything up, it worked, and we failed it back to the normal primary site. And last week, on Wednesday, he emailed and said, I had to fail over to the standby last night. Thank you for providing good documentation so that I didn't have to wake you up and call you. And I knew exactly what to do because it was all laid out for me in the documentation, and it was very clear and concise. I knew what to expect. It was a very proud moment of, okay, we actually did something right, and not that it was surprising. Of course, we do things right all the time, but it was nice to see that the documentation was read by somebody and was useful. So I think that's the most important thing to me, is documenting.
Okay. Do you have a personal philosophy related to your work as a DBA?
A personal philosophy. I guess if there is anything, it's along the lines of the golden rule. I mean, I always try to engage with other people in the way that I would want them to act if I were on the other side of things. And as a result, I spend a lot of time in volunteering with the RAC Special Interest Group and other groups in volunteering time and knowledge. I'm a big believer in that if you give away something, you'll get something back ultimately. And I want all the people that are involved in those groups to also contribute, and try to make myself an example of that, I guess, by contributing and hoping that when I need something, I'll be able to find the same information in return. I guess that I do consciously think about that I got to handle this in the way that I would want. How would I want it done if I was doing it? And what's right, and doing ultimately what I should do, because that's the right thing to do, and that's what I would want them to do for me.
Okay, great. Just one of your golden rules that you follow when you work for a client.
Yeah, that certainly is it. I would want them, and the documentation goes right along with that, right? I mean, I would want somebody to, if I hired someone for a project, I would want them to number one, I guess, prove that they actually did something for me. But really the way that they can do that, obviously I maybe have asked them to install a new RAC cluster for me. I can see that it's up and it's working and my developer's using it and that sort of thing. But I also want to have something to show for it other than the work product, including all the documentation I would need to maintain it. And if another consultant or one of my own staff, or I hired someone new, I should be able to hand them a piece of documentation and have them read it and have at least 80% of their questions answered without having to necessarily teach them everything about it, through story or legend. It's something that requires documentation, and it saves time in the long run. As people turn over, it's part of the industry, and they get new jobs, and people are constantly coming in and out of different roles. It's good to have all that stuff down somewhere, maintained.
Dan, we want to thank you. Your time is very valuable, and we appreciate that you share with us your thoughts here in Oracle Open World. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you.